Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome to the the series that we're doing with Perrin and Polaris. We're really excited to be here tonight and dive into, the group practice strategies. So my name's Janina. I'm with CareStack, and tonight we have this presentation brought to you by CareStack and our partners at Darby and Polaris.
Thank you, Janina. I appreciate the introduction. Love the partnership with y'all at CareStack, and obviously love our friends at Darby as well for putting this on tonight. This is for those attending. This is the third, I think it is, in a 7-part webinar series around building a successful group practice. And if you were able to join us for the first 2 sessions in the 7-part series, welcome back. If you happen to have missed those, you can go back and watch the recordings of them, or you can reach out to us and we can send you a YouTube video link where you can see that. Once again, like I say, thanks to Janine and Andrea and everybody at CareStack and Darby for hosting us and helping promote this series. Here's the disclosure slide. There's not a whole lot to disclose. I am part owner of Polaris Healthcare Partners, but no other money's changing hands, and all the opinions I'm going to share are mine and mine alone. As Janine mentioned, my name's Perrin Desports. I am one of the co-founders and partner here at Polaris Healthcare Partners. And Polaris is a firm that guides entrepreneurial dentists to build and ultimately exit successful group practices. For those who are in the audience that have followed our podcast, or maybe if you saw the first or second session in the series here, you'll know that we dive pretty deep into our subject matter. It's typically very granular in nature, very numbers and analytically driven. So for those who would like to download a copy of tonight's webinar, there's your QR code. I'll give you a second to fill out first name, last name, email address, and download a PDF copy of the deck that you'll be able to refer back to at your leisure. Give you a second to do just that. Hopefully everybody is getting that done. If not, there'll be a QR code at the end where you can download again. So, Kelsey, I think we may have actually a poll question to share with the audience real quick. Can you chime in for us?
You bet. I'm going to go ahead and launch that really quick. And it is, how many practices have you acquired beyond the first practice you started with? And we'll leave that open here for just a couple seconds so everyone can get their responses in. All right, I'm going to close it out for everyone. So I'm going to share the results here. So 60% said 0, 27% said 1, 7% said 2, and 7% said 3.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So, one quick note, if you have questions, go ahead and submit them through the chat feature, and we'll try to batch those and answer them at the end of the presentation. This is a presentation that will probably run right up to the hour, and if I run the clock out by mistake, I'll try to follow up with everyone or send out a Q&A dialogue at the end to get your questions answered, okay? So one of the questions I do get very frequently when I'm at a conference or speaking from a stage or hosting clients is, am I too late? It seems like everybody and their brother wants to build a group dental practice. And sometimes people are correct to say, have I missed the boat? Is it too late? Is there no longer any opportunity for value creation or exit in mind? And I would tell you the answer to that question is no. As a matter of fact, the doctor-led groups and emerging groups are still the fastest growing segment in this space, and there are a lot of them that pop up seemingly every day. I think we have a very solid 10-year plus run ahead of us, not only to acquire practices, buy or build practices for that matter, but also if you want to exit practices or just simply operate them for cash flow purposes. I don't think you've missed the boat by any stretch, and I don't think you're too late to create a lot of value. Far from it. I love this Chinese proverb because it says the best time to start a business was 20 years ago. The second best time is right now. And I think that's kind of the mindset you need to operate with if you are going to build a group practice. For those in the audience, you may or may not have heard of a book called Good to Great. It was written by Jim Collins and his think tank. It was one of a series of books that they wrote. They're all really good. Good to Great was probably the greatest seller out of all of them. He's got a number of great quotes, and one of them is, whether you prevail or fail depends more on what you do to yourself than what the world does to you. And the reason I threw that in this deck is because really, when people start to build a group practice, they start worrying about everything that everybody else is doing. The enterprise level DSO that set up shop right across the street from them, the rising interest rates, and on and on and on. The things they ultimately can't control. And Collins's quote is very emblematic of all of us as entrepreneurs, in that if we just stick to the knitting, if we just focus on what we can control in our four walls, we can really build a world beater business. And I think that's the appropriate way to approach building a group. That being said, there are a handful of fundamentals to address. And the first is simply understanding the fundamentals of building a group and avoiding failure. So here's a comment we hear with alarming regularity. I own 4 practices now. How is it that I'm making less income than when I only owned 1? And this is a very common phenomenon, and it has a very appropriate answer to it. And I'm going to walk you through some math behind it and hopefully give you a little bit of clarity on it. So the first aspect to solve for is how you're going to replace yourself in a clinical capacity. If you have one successful practice, it probably generates a healthy amount of income for you and your family. But if you're going to build a growing group, you can't really do it from behind the chair. So there's going to be some level of transition off of a clinical role and into a leadership role. The second aspect to solve for is a clear understanding of what EBITDA is, and it's a proxy for operating cash flow. In our world, it's normalized post-doctor compensation. And the key to EBITDA is that it's a basis for valuation of group practices. And it's also one of the primary drivers for how banks look at leverage and lending in the group practice space. There'll be a webinar coming up toward the end of this series about growth capital, where we'll dig into that more thoroughly. The third aspect to solve for is understanding free cash flow. And free cash flow is essentially our take-home income as an entrepreneur, and it's calculated after debt service and after taxes. So when you look at your business on a profit and loss statement from your accountant, it shows some level of net income. When you talk with people about valuation in group practices, they talk about EBITDA or EBITDA multiples. And then when you think about the money that you and your spouse spend on your kids and on yourselves, that's a measure of free cash flow. And those 3 calculations are not one and the same. So let's take them apart really quickly and try to provide a little bit of clarity behind this. Here is a Mickey Mouse example, if you will. A general dentistry practice that generates about $1 million in revenue. It's split 80-20 clinical to hygiene, and it's running a 60% overhead rate. That business yields owner income, pre-tax income of about $400,000. We pay some blended tax rate using 25% to estimate here. And let's say this business has no debt on it, so there's nothing to pay the bank. So we pay Uncle Sam their fair share of $100,000, and it leaves us with $300,000 of free cash flow. When we cast that same business from an EBITDA perspective, it is a business that generates $1 million in revenue, split 80-20 clinical to hygiene with a 60% overhead rate, like I mentioned before. But we normalize the doctor compensation piece with a clinical compensation rate. And in this case, it's 30% of his or her collections. So the doctor compensation that's attributed to the clinical work performed is about $240,000. When you take your $1 million in revenue and you subtract your overhead and your doctor compensation, it leaves an entrepreneurial profit of about $160,000, which is a close enough approximation of EBITDA for this example, meaning our EBITDA margin is about 16% of revenue. Again, no debt service, free cash flow of $300,000. So let's acquire a practice, and let's buy a practice that is basically constituted the same way as the one we own. Generates $1 million in revenue. If it's listed by a broker, this thing might sell for 80% of revenue as a valuation. It's split 80-20 clinical to hygiene, running the same 60% overhead rate. and we pay our doctor, our associate in this context, 30% of his or her collections, much the way we do in our own practice, leaving an entrepreneurial profit of $160,000. To buy this business for $800,000 when it's generating $160,000 of EBITDA is a 5 times EBITDA multiple. Put another way, $160,000 of EBITDA times 5 equals 800,000. So there's your first sort of way to reconcile EBITDA valuation versus percentage of revenue or percentage of collections. Now, this is a business that if we're paying an associate to work in it and we're deriving $160,000 of entrepreneurial profit out of it, we pay 25% in taxes, blended rate again. It costs us roughly $97,000 over a 10-year term at a 4% rate to pay back the bank. And after we pay Uncle Sam and the bank, we're left with about $23,000 of free cash flow, which is attributed to us as the entrepreneur who acquired the practice. Well, this is now a business that has 2 locations, and we'd like to buy more locations, and we know that we can't do that from behind the chair. So here's the first part where you start to lose ground, is where you hire an associate to pick up a couple of days of work, from clinical work from you, so that you can focus more on business development and finding additional practices to buy. So we're gonna work 2 days, and we're gonna pay an associate to work 2 days, and we're gonna pay him or her that same 30% clinical compensation rate. This drops our clinical income in half to $120,000. We still make the same margin of $160,000, but it lowers our pre-tax owner income to $280,000. And when we pay taxes, now our free cash flow is dropped from $300,000 to about $210,000. Here is the business we just acquired, and we want to buy another one. As a matter of fact, it's set up all but the same way. It's another $1 million in revenue, but this is a practice that when we acquire it is more of a competitive process. Maybe there are other third parties who want to buy the business. Maybe it just values more highly. We're going to end up paying 90% of revenue or $900,000 for this business. It is also running a higher overhead rate. Maybe the staff has been there their entire careers. Maybe it's just a higher fixed cost structure, but it's running 5% greater overhead than the prior practice that we acquired. So this business values slightly higher, and it's running a slightly higher overhead rate, still paying the associate the same amount in terms of clinical compensation, but it yields a lot less in terms of entrepreneurial profit. And this is the first time that we see on an EBITDA multiple basis that we're actually overpaying for this practice. And when we start to calculate our tax allocation to the government, and the fact that it costs us about $109,000 to borrow over a 10-year term at a 4% rate, this is the first situation where we actually start to go into the red in terms of free cash flow. Well, we don't want to stop growing, but we might not want to buy another $1 million practice. So we're going to look for slightly smaller practice, in this case, one that might be akin to the ADA average of about $750,000 in revenue. And it's going to value at a lot lower rate, half what we paid on the prior business. So $450,000, we're going to buy this business. It's a 60% valuation percentage of revenue. It's too good of a deal to pass up. Slightly different revenue mix between clinical and hygiene, but because it's generating less in revenue, it also is running a slightly higher overhead rate. And this is a scenario where you can see that it's not generating a tremendous amount of EBITDA for us, and the EBITDA multiple we're paying is quite large. Once again, lower overall debt service over the same term and same interest rate. But here's another scenario that even though we paid less in terms of total dollars for this business, and even though we paid less in terms of a percentage for the business, we're actually losing ground once again. So what the heck happened? Here we had our $1 million revenue practice where we were making about $300,000 in free cash flow for our families. We went out and basically quadrupled the size of the business in terms of number of locations and in terms of the amount of revenue. But here we are even though we have a business that's 4 times as large, we're actually generating more pre-tax owner income, but after paying taxes and after paying the bank for the debt service, we're making about 50% less in take-home income. And I would tell you that this is a scenario that we see the vast majority of clients encountering when they start to expand. They overpay for practices, they fail to calculate free cash flow, and it ends up catching them out in terms of an income hit to them. So the second key in this early transition is deciding what you want to build, why you want to build it, and how fast you intend to do it. This next slide is a question we ask in almost all of our decks because it's really an appropriate question that most people don't slow down long enough to really decide for themselves. And this is not something you can ask yourself in the middle of this webinar, but I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time, maybe over the weekend or on Friday if you're not treating patients, with a cup of coffee and think it through. And it's as follows. If we're having this conversation 3 to 5 years from now, what does success look like for you, both personally and professionally? What does success look like for you personally and professionally 3 to 5 years out? It's really important to get clear around that because these businesses, especially in their early stages of growth, exact a toll. They take a toll in terms of our personal lives. The next piece is what you're trying to build and why you're trying to build it. What is the growth and the size of the business that you're intending to create here? How fast do you want to add locations? How many locations is it? And how big is each location? It's a significant difference in acquiring or building a 10 operatory practice versus one that has only 4 or 5 operatories. Are you going to build it to such a level that you require centralization and building a back-end platform and a call center to go along with it? Is this going to be a common brand across all locations, or is it going to be uniquely branded in each different location? Realistically speaking, what's the level of stress in terms of debt and chaos that you're prepared to deal with in the coming years? And that's different for everybody, but it's something definitely worth considering. If you're the sole owner of your business right now, do you intend to keep it that way? Or are you going to possibly allow for associates to earn in or buy into the business? Or if you acquire a practice, are you going to allow somebody to roll equity into your business? Do you want to keep 100% of the ownership to yourself? Or are you willing to allow for minority partners to come along with you? And is this a business that's built for exit, meaning a transaction and a sale? Or is it built for free cash flow and more of a lifestyle business? Those can be significantly different. So it's sort of decision tree, you know? I mean, do you want to build and operate a lifestyle business, or do you want to build something that's really growth and scale and ultimately for sale? If it's build and operate, it's really a business that's intended to generate a level of personal income for you and your family. It's akin to a lifestyle business, maybe 3 to 5 locations. Focus on primarily personal income, possibly as the sole owner, but with what I would call a manageable level of stress and low debt level. Limited expansion and certainly no centralization for that. On the other hand, if it's a business that you want to exit, you're probably going to reinvest a lot of the income, the distributable income, out of the business for growth purposes, intending to have a greater sale amount. This is a business that's probably going to be 6 to 10 locations or more. It's going to be focused on an exit to create wealth out of a transaction. Probably realistic to assume that you're going to have multiple partners with different equity stakes and different levels in the business. It's a much more dynamic organization with typically a lot higher debt level. And that's probably going to be a question as to whether or not you make the decision to centralize back-end services for scale. Michael Porter is a Harvard Business School and Wharton School professor, and he's written a lot of seminal textbooks around competitive advantage and competitive strategy. And one of his famous quotes is, Strategy 101 is all about choices. You can't be everything to everybody. And the essence of strategy is simply choosing what not to do. The third key to this is defining your time frame and your outcome and really reverse engineering those expectations. Again, is the outcome more passive income or is it a transaction in wealth? Get clear on what the dollar amount is you intend to generate out of this, and also how long you want to take to get there. and then reverse engineer the numbers to figure out the level of activity you've got to have each and every year until you hit that finish line. So if you say that, what I want to build is a business that'll generate passive income of about $1 million to $1.5 million every year, and do it within 5 years, versus a business that I can sell maybe for a net walk away of $10 million in 5 years. Those can be really different businesses and different strategies to employ. So this is taken from a model that I kind of whitewashed, and really one where when we work with clients, just as an example, we tend to reverse engineer those expectations. So we want to find out how many practices they intend to buy or build each year. And we want to project out the amount of revenue, EBITDA, and certainly the debt service associated with it to understand how the business performs that year and every additional year over about a 3 to 5 year period. And at the end of 5 years, we want to see if, based on those assumptions and projections, would this business in fact yield, in this case, EBITDA and the debt service associated with it? Would it in fact yield $1 million to $1.5 million in owner income at the end of that period? And obviously it would do just that. That may be slightly different from a similar model based around a transaction. Obviously, another 5-year projection where we want to see the volume of EBITDA and be able to reliably forecast what a multiple might be in terms of valuation if they were to transact the business at that point in time, pay off debt, pay off taxes, and have some amount in terms of a net walkaway number. So this is, again, taken from a client model, but it's one that kind of illustrates the point that you may not have to be as thorough and even sophisticated as a model of like this, but it's really important to map out the next 3 to 5 years with whatever those intentions are to make sure that your activities are going to yield the outcome that you want. You want to make sure that the journey is worth your while to do it. So let's talk about solving for success in the buy versus build conundrum. The next webinar in this series is going to be about a de novo approach. Tonight, we're going to focus on acquisitions, and there are, positives and negatives to both. Acquisitions are arguably easier to find, and there is some level of existing patients, staff, hopefully an associate or a dentist in there is going to stay on board, and some level of positive EBITDA. And hopefully, once again, there are positive synergies if you buy that business. There are things that you can bring to the table in terms of revenue generation and cost containment that would allow you to improve that business. Negatives for acquisitions are that you're probably going to pay a little bit more for them versus a de novo. And the real key that catches a lot of people out is that there are typically a lot of culture and change management issues post-acquisition. Let me put that quite slightly differently. Long tenured employees don't like change. And if you buy somebody else's business, especially if the seller stays on board, you're probably going to hear, well, that's not the way he or she did it forever. So you have to be eyes wide open about that. Overall, though, acquisitions are seen as having less downside risk. So let's talk about strategies as it relates to acquiring practices and what some of this may look like here. The first thing that we work with clients on is developing something called a target acquisition profile. Now, this is kind of a Mickey Mouse example, but if I told you we're going to go hunting, you might ask, well, are we going to shoot at birds? Are we going to shoot at elk or deer or some kind of big game? According to that, am I going to need a rifle or a shotgun? What type of ammunition should I pack? And is it going to be warm or cold? Or what type of clothing and camouflage do I need? You wouldn't just walk out the front door with any type of firearm to go hunting if you didn't know what you were hunting for. And that similar train of thought is what we talk about in terms of target acquisition profile. Here's the dirty little secret. If you talk to the men and women who lead the business development offices for enterprise level DSOs, they will tell you that they really only swing at about 10 to 20% of the pitches they get. Put another way, they pass on about 80 to 90% of the practices they see. The reason for that is exactly the Michael Porter quote from earlier. They know what they are and they know what they're not, and they would rather take a pass on an acquisition out of fear of it going bad, and run the risk of missing on a good acquisition to do it. A bad acquisition is going to cost you time, money, and a lot of distractions. So just because you find a practice is for sale does not mean that you should buy it. George Radigan, the former VP of Business Development for North American Dental Group, has a great saying, and this is what you see in front of you. Acquisitions come down to two things: cash flows and risk. Where can you increase your cash flow and where can you reduce your risk? And that is really, really true. So when it comes time to build your own target acquisition profile, there are a handful of things you want to think about. One is location and capacity. This practice you're looking to buy, how far away is it? And does it fit within your geography? Does it have a minimum number of operatories? Again, the men and women who run enterprise level DSOs will tell you they will not acquire a practice with less than 6 operatories. Why? Because it creates provider dependency. And that is not something you want if you have to turn over an associate and it creates dark revenue days. Are there opportunities to expand the facility itself or expand even days and hours? What's the service mix and the payer mix? Does that practice you're about to acquire perform clinical services you do not? Or do you perform clinical services they do not, in which case it might be an immediate pickup. If they perform clinical services that you don't, that's an element of jeopardy and an element of risk. So do you have the systems and processes to accommodate things like government payer versus fee-for-service or traditional PPO? Is this thing going to need some level of capital investment from you? Are you going to need to add or replace people working in it? Do you need to invest in training, like some type of clinical training, skill development? Or do you need to replace any capital equipment or digital technology? And if you do, when? What about culture and change management? How long have the employees been there? Are they amenable to change? And how do you intend to communicate that? Will their culture mesh with yours? And are there things pre-acquisition and post-acquisition that we can do to mitigate any of those risks? These are simply defining strike zones that you will not swing at, and there's some level of discipline involved with just saying no. Here's an example of what that target acquisition profile looks like from our perspective. Again, this is just one that we built, but you can build your own. It doesn't have to be this thorough, but my goal here is to tell you that you got to gain some level of objectivity as it relates to acquiring businesses, and simply because it's for sale does not mean that you should be the one to buy it. Furthermore, if you do buy a practice, you never buy a practice to simply maintain it. You always buy a business to improve it, and you want to quantify what those improvements are. So what do I mean by that? I mean, do you think that you can have some type of clinical service pickup that's enabled by technology-driven applications? Can you recapture some level of specialty services, increase hygiene efficiency? Is your marketing program better? You can generate more new patients and conversions. And how do your fees compare with those of the existing practice? Can you expand capacity? Again, days and hours. Could you actually add more treatment rooms if you chose to make the investment in it? Reducing broken appointments and openings and increasing case acceptance rates. And then cost reductions. Obviously, dental supplies. Darby's great at working with clients on a formulary basis to reduce the cost of supplies, and it's worth that for you to control some of that ordering, from your different locations, and other cost reductions along the way, professional services, marketing costs, and others. As a basic example of this, here's that same $1 million practice on the left-hand side, and when we think about what we may be able to do with the business after we acquire it, maybe we can grow revenue, maybe we can reduce overhead slightly. And if we can drive more EBITDA to the bottom line and do something called dollar cost averaging down our EBITDA multiple that we ultimately paid for the practice. And this is really cooking with gas. This is what enterprise level DSOs do all the time and do quite well, honestly. So when we think about acquiring practices, more than likely, you're going to approach acquisitions from a standpoint of acquiring 100% of that business, meaning whoever the seller is going to sell his or her business to you in its entirety, and maybe they'll work back for a period of time, or maybe they're going to retire and ride off into the sunset imminently. And there are a couple things to keep in mind here. If the ADA average general dentistry practice generates about $750,000 in revenue, typical valuations from a broker are going to land somewhere between 60 and 80% of revenue. That's not hard and fast, but that's just where we see a lot of them landing in the marketplace. Brokers charge about 10% of the sale price to the seller. So if you can reach these people before they list their business with a seller, you can probably save them a little bit of commissions and probably avoid a competitive process for yourself. All parties win in that scenario. Regardless, you do want to have some third party do a valuation of the business to make sure that you understand the areas for potential improvement or cost reduction, and also what the valuation of the practice should be. And there's a due diligence period that's going to be some level of bank ledgers and statements. Again, I would have an independent third-party service technician evaluate, the overall operations of the business: chairs, lights, units, pumps, compressors, intraoral and extraoral X-rays, et cetera, et cetera. Those things can be really costly, and if one of them's about to die or on its last leg, or you got a practice with a shot count of 50,000 on the digital pan, you'd rather know that before you buy the business. So really trying to get behind some of the operational diligence of the business. This is an acquisition when you buy 100% of their business that's 100% risk and 100% reward. More than likely, the seller is going to transition out at some point in time, and you've got to be very confident that you can source an associate, and probably quickly. You might also want to drop an associate in there on day one to expand days and hours, obviously. What is the age and tenure and predisposition of the staff? If they've been there forever, they're probably carrying high wages, and they're probably very set in their ways. On the other hand, if all of them are brand spanking new, that probably means that the seller is a bit of a tyrant who turns over his or her associates on a very frequent basis. So you want to glean some information from the age, tenure, and predisposition of the staff. Are there going to be potential integration challenges when you acquire this practice and integrate it into your network? What does the patient base look like? What's the maintenance and the upkeep of the facility? Kind of like I mentioned earlier. Is there going to be likely some level of CapEx investment? Capital equipment expenditure is CapEx. And this really needs to be a diamond in the rough. You may look at it as a $750,000 revenue business, but if it's got 6 operatories, maybe you're confident with your marketing, your clinical skill development, and putting another associate in there that it can generate revenues of $1 million, $1.25 million, $1.5 million in fairly short order. So it's got a lot of upside to it. And it really is an acquisition that's more based around upside than it is the valuation. But 100% risk, 100% reward on you and your team. So the 3 keys to success in a scenario such as this are that you really want to look at it 12 to 24 months out and quantify the upside that you think you can generate in that business. The integration team that you have, is there leadership in place to manage the change and the impact on the people that you just acquired? How willing are they going to be to go along to get along? And can you pressure test it? When we say pressure test it, we mean, okay, if you buy this business and something were to happen, revenue takes a downturn, how much of a downturn can it take before you start to go into the red, operationally speaking, let alone debt service? That's your margin for error. You don't want to focus on the downside, don't get me wrong, but I would sure want to know what type of margin I'm playing with there. So I mentioned earlier in one of the prior slides about equity and ownership, and I think I said something to the effect of, do you want to bring on any minority partners, be they associates or people who roll equity into your business? And this is that scenario. We find that when dentists want to build a group practice, they typically go about building a group practice through acquisition instead of de novo. We'll talk about de novo on the next webinar. But they also look at acquisitions in only one way, which is acquiring 100% of the business. I would tell you that there are a lot of people out there that are maybe later stage career. They're not ready for retirement yet. They might be looking for a safe harbor, but they also want to be part of a growing business that they didn't want to take the risk themselves to start. And allowing them to roll some equity into your business can have a lot of merit for both sides, and it arguably can allow you to access another segment of the market that might not be listed with a broker. And enterprise level DSOs are incredibly good at this very game, and I'm going to show you a kind of an example of it in just a second here. So I liken this kind of equity roll piece as one where it's kind of the best of both worlds. A seller can take some chips off the table, meaning they can get cash for the value of their business, but they leave some dollars in with you and your business to participate in the upside without as much risk. In other words, if you're building a much larger group and you want to sell the group in a couple of years, maybe they can get a taste of that without having to take on the risk to do it on their own. You're essentially buying 60 to 80% of their business, certainly control of their business. One of the questions you want to ask is, where does their equity reside? Does it stay at a practice level, or are you going to allow them to roll it into a management company or DSO level? And are you going to allow them to own only that 20% stake, or might they be able to take some risks along the way and do some type of a JV structure? If you do this right, you might find that this seller becomes your best advocate, meaning they've all got friends from dental societies, dental schools, study clubs, the country club, whatever else. And if this goes well, then maybe they tell their friends about what a great experience they had selling their business to you and how much they're enjoying working with you and your group moving forward. And that can help you build out a new market if done correctly. So let me walk through some math and I'll hopefully bring this to light on what some of it may look like, okay? So we've got a group practice that generates about $3 million in revenue at a 20% EBITDA margin, and our group values at about 6 times EBITDA, or $3.6 million. We find a practice that we want to buy, and it has revenues of about $1 million, 20% EBITDA margin, and it values at a 4 times EBITDA multiple, or about $800,000, which you see here on the bottom. We're going to acquire that practice. Now, in this scenario, you would never buy 50% of the business, but it makes the math a little bit easier to follow. So just work with me for a second on this. So we're going to buy 50% of that business valued at $800,000, meaning we're going to take on debt to buy $400,000 worth, and the seller is going to roll the remaining $400,000 into our business. When he or she does that, the combined valuation of the business is now $4.8 million. So we have just created a much more valuable, much larger business at this point. We've taken on $400,000 in debt to do it. And when we do so, we now have a minority partner that has a $400,000 stake in our business that's worth about 8.3% of the overall company. We own the other 91.67%, or $4.4 million. Over some period of time, we operate the group. We grow revenue and we improve our EBITDA margins. This is now a business that generates about $6 million in total revenue and an EBITDA of about $1.5 million. And at that point, we want to take the business to market and sell it. So let's say that this $1.5 million EBITDA group values at an 8 times EBITDA multiple. Here is where the business sells for $12 million. And our junior partner, our minority partner, has essentially sold his or her business twice. They sold the first half of it to us for $400,000, and they roll the additional $400,000 into our business. They're a minority partner at a little bit over 8%. And when we transact the entire business, that 8% is worth about $1 million. When you add that $1 million to the $400,000 that we gave them a couple of years ago when we bought half their business, they have a total outcome of about 1.4 million on a business that originally generated only $1 million in revenue and valued at only $800,000. And this is a scenario that we see very often at an enterprise DSO level. It's very attractive to people who have arguably built very successful solo practices, but have kind of taken them as far as they can or as far as they've been willing to from a risk standpoint. They just don't want to take on more debt and add more locations or blow out a wall and add more operatories, but they'd like to take some chips off the table, in this case about 400 grand worth, and they'd like to roll some equity and participate, to go along for the ride with you in the business that you're building. And if you're going to build a business, a multi-location group, and you're going to do it through acquisitions, maybe you can acquire a couple of practices, 100% of them, if all you desire to do is build a 3 to 5 location group. There's nothing wrong with that. On the other hand, if you want to build a much larger business, especially one for exit, maybe 6 to 10 to 20 locations, to try to build a business that large with only one acquisition tool in your toolbox, which is acquiring 100% of the practices you buy, I think you're selling yourself a little bit short. And I think you need to learn the discipline of what a lot of enterprise level DSOs know, and that is that you can allow somebody to roll equity into your business, be a minority partner, still maintain outright control of the business, and open yourself up to a totally different segment of the market space that might be more mine ready to join a business like yours. So I liken this to your best option, really. There's a little bit less risk and maybe slightly less reward. But the key here is that you can maintain control with some level of certainty of continuity. If they roll equity in with you, they're not leaving. They're not going to go anywhere else. They rolled equity in with you because they wanted to stay, but they haven't rolled enough to obstruct your ability to govern the business and make decisions. So you don't have to worry about having to take a vote every time you want to change toilet paper in your group. That's not the case at all. The likelihood is that they rolled equity because they want to be part of something bigger than themselves, and they're not willing to take on the risk to do it. And that's where you come into play. At a minimum, you've got an anchor doctor who's going to be there for a while. At best, you might have a local director of business development who will help you build the business faster through some of his or her colleagues. The keys to success here are those that I mentioned earlier, for sure. But in addition to that, you really want to understand the equity structure that you're proposing, where their equity is going to reside, the rights and privileges that come along with it, and certainly how distributions are going to be used in your business going forward. You want to understand their future role. If the seller rolls equity in with you, are they just looking for a second bite of the apple on an outcome, or do they want to help you build something bigger that'll make their equity stake greater? Like, do they just want to be a clinical dentist, or do they want to really do more than that and help you build a bigger business? And again, if done correctly, this may be a great opportunity for you to network within their sphere of influence, and it might open you up for acquisitions to a segment of the market space that hasn't raised their hand to say that they're ready for exit yet. So here are a couple of key takeaways to consider. And the first is really what this series is all about, and that's building a group practice. I mentioned, for those who don't know us, Polaris is a consulting and sell-side advisory firm that focuses exclusively with group dental practices. That being said, I don't think building a group practice is the right step for everybody, because candidly, we see a lot of failure with it. And, if you're, say, 5 years from retirement, I don't know that it's worth the risk, the headache, the debt burden, the stress, and a lot else if your core business is performing well. On the other hand, if you've got 10 years or more to go before you retire, I think it's something you absolutely have to consider. And the reason for that is you may have a practice that generates a lot of cash flow for you and your family right now. But our world is changing, and there are a lot of threats that you don't control. And there are a lot of things that are going to impact the potential cash flows out of that business beyond the next 5 years. So to think that you're your successful solo practice is going to generate the same level of income for you and your family unabated for the next 10 to 20 years is, I think that's a risky mindset to have. I'll just put it that way. And I think if you're going to consider building a group practice, you don't have to build a group practice that's 20 locations, but you might want to build something that's simply not dependent upon your clinical skills, slightly larger than you. So the key takeaways here are that it's not too late to start. You haven't missed the boat. There's still ample opportunity to create success. But if you are going to do it, you really do want to understand financial metrics and financial calculations. And you want to get clear on what you want to build, why you want to build it, and how fast you intend to do so. And the last bullet is really to become a student. You're on this webinar tonight to learn something and to seek knowledge and learn from the experience of others. And you owe it to yourself to do that because, like I say, we see a lot of people growing through trial and error and stepping on landmines. And that just wastes a lot of time and it costs you a lot of money in the long run. The first step towards getting anywhere is simply to decide that you're not going to stay where you are. And if building a group practice is the right thing, then that's the first mindset to have. All opinions are mine. Darby and CareStack and all of our friends didn't pay me to say any of this. For those that are looking for CE tonight, your verification code for this webinar is PAREN with a capital P 2023. That'll get you your CE. And if you like what you heard on the webinar this evening, and you like these types of business knowledge, at least, I'd encourage you to subscribe to our podcast. It's called Group Practice Accelerator. You can find it on our website, but it is also on Apple, TuneIn, Spotify, Stitcher, all the major outlets that you can subscribe to there. And you may also want to consider subscribing to the news feed on our website. We drop about 2 podcasts a week, but we also drop videos, white papers, speaking events, all kinds of good stuff there that you can learn about and stay abreast. And if you're interested in learning more about building a group practice and deciding if it's the right thing for you, you may want to consider coming and spending a day with us. Our Discovery Day sessions are one-on-one sessions with clients where we teach the fundamentals of group practices. And the nice thing about it being one-on-one is that you can really ask any question you want. It's not a group setting, so there's nothing too personal in nature or seemingly too dumb in terms of questions. There are no dumb questions. This is a lot of subject matter that y'all are not aware of, and the benefit of those one-on-one sessions is you can ask anything you want. And over a 6 to 7 hour day together, we can chase a lot of rabbits down a lot of different holes, and we get a lot of good feedback on those Discovery Day sessions. So maybe that's the right next step if you're contemplating building a group practice. If you'd like to learn more, and want to do it in a classroom setting, this October 11th through 13th, we'll be hosting a conference in conjunction with Dr. Mark Costas at the Dental Success Institute. We did our first one last year with him and his team. It's called Scaling from Clinician to CEO, and it involves a lot of the fundamentals of group practices. And you can use that discount code of DD100 for a 10% discount off the registration. The QR code is there. I don't think we've opened up registration yet, but it will be coming. We're going to launch it at the Dental Success Summit in about another 3 or 4 weeks, so stay tuned for that. And if you like this webinar a lot, I encourage you to join us next month for the second piece of growth strategy, which is all about de novos and cold starts. We'll have some information to share with you there. You can open it up to some Q&A, and like I promised at the beginning, for those that joined on late, if you'd like to download a PDF copy of this deck, you can do it off the QR code on the left-hand side. And if you have any other questions that you want to talk about in person, you can book a call with me or one of our advisors off the QR code on the right-hand side. And there is my contact information as well. So I think that covers everything, and we just about made our deadline. We have any, I didn't feel too rushed, I hope. It was a lot of information. Do we have any questions or anything that anybody may have submitted, Kelsey?
I don't have anything yet, but just wanted to go through a couple of housekeeping things. We did record the webinar, So we're going to be sending that out to everyone tonight if you'd like to watch it again, as well as with the link to register for the next webinar in our series, which is on June 21st at the same time, 7 Eastern. So you'll be getting an email from us this week. And Perrin, do you mind just pulling back to the CE code slide? We'll just put it up for everyone. We're getting a lot of requests for that. You're
Sure.
okay with that? Yeah, and I don't have any questions, so we'll just leave that up for everybody. And if we have a question come in, I'll just close out here in a minute. We'll be good to go.
Excellent. Well, I certainly appreciate everybody joining us tonight. Thank you for your time and your attention. Hopefully this was some valuable content that made you think about things in a slightly different way. And if you like what you heard, join us next month for the de novo one. After that, it's associate, attracting entertaining associates, then growth capital solutions, and then exit strategy is the final of the 7-part series. So hopefully there's a lot of good information for people depending on what they want to build.
Awesome. Thanks, Perrin. I didn't get any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and end the webinar. And thanks everybody for joining us.
You bet. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it. Have a good night.
Bye-bye.